So just firstly, my name's Ben. If I haven't met you, I'm one of the leaders here at Soul City, and it's great to be here with you. Also, just to say, I'm trying out a new mic system, so if it's weird or wrong or you can't hear, let me know and I'll swap back to the other one. But my hope was that this mic system might actually be nicer to hear. So let me know afterwards if it worked or not, but that's just my little disclaimer before we get going. We started last week a series based on what is, for me, my favorite part of the whole Bible, I think, is the Sermon on the Mount. And we started looking at this last week. And the idea was that we didn't want to have lots of lots of sermons from it. We wanted to dig deep and do something which felt more teaching. And we wanted to try and help equip you to be able to look into the Bible and unpack it for yourself. And we wanted to ask the question, what is Jesus really saying in these verses? And I think a lot of the time it's easy to hear what somebody's reflection on what Jesus is saying is, or what a lovely saying is based on what Jesus is saying is. But what I want to know is, if Jesus was standing right here today, what would be the words that he would want to speak to us? And that's what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to dig in. We gave out some notebooks last week that look like this. So if you've remembered yours and you've still got it, then you are in my good books. If you weren't here and you would like a free notebook, I've got some here that Mark can give out to anybody who raises their hand, and would love to give you a free notebook, because I just think it's helpful sometimes to be able to write down things and think about it in that way. And if you got one last week and you forgot it, then that's on you. But let's today dive straight away into this passage. And we're going to read Matthew 5, starting at verse 17. And it says this: "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So, if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This for me is one of those passages in the Bible that I just read and I'm just like, I'll just keep moving on. This doesn't feel like the exciting bits. I like the real drama where he's talking about plucking out eyes and stuff like that. Those are the good bits. This is the bit I just read and I move on. And I wonder, do you know what this means? Instinctively, do you read this and think, well, I know what this means. It's obviously he's saying this. Because when I read this, I've got all kinds of questions. Like, firstly, the law of Moses and the writing of the prophets, what that is describing is the whole of the Old Testament. He's talking about all of the Jewish scriptures. And he says, I didn't come to abolish the scriptures. I didn't come to abolish the Old Testament. But here's the thing. I was listening to a speaker called Andy Stanley, who's a famous preacher in the church. And he's just written a book, and he says exactly the opposite. He says that Jesus did come to abolish the Old Testament, that we don't need the Old Testament anymore because it's old, and we have a New Testament now. And I get lots of people ask me this question. They're like, Ben, it feels kind of like there's two different authors. There's the Old Testament guy and the New Testament guy. And the Old Testament guy, he's like super judgy, and he's got all of these things that we need to obey. And the New Testament guy, like I'd invite him to a party. He's pretty cool. What do we do with these two? Do we just abandon the Old Testament and read the New Testament? Or do we have to still obey the Old Testament? And Andy Stanley said, no. You can forget the Old Testament. We just read the New Testament now. And he quotes this verse, which is in Hebrews 8. And it says this, Hebrews 8:13 says, When God speaks of a new covenant, it means he made the first one obsolete. It is now out of date and will soon disappear. The word testament, Old Testament, does anybody know what the word Old Testament means? It means Old Covenant. And so in Hebrews, the author is saying that there was an old covenant and a new covenant, and the old covenant is obsolete and it's faded and we don't need it anymore. And so people like Andy are saying, well, if the old one is obsolete, why do we read it? I mean, there's some nice psalms and poetry and bits and pieces, but do we need this? And that's really what I want to dig into, just this question. And this is a big question, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this over a couple of weeks. I want to speak today into a big picture version of this question, like what do we do with the Old Testament? What do we think Jesus meant when he said that I did not come to abolish the law of Moses, I came to accomplish their purpose, I came to fulfill. What does that mean? I want to speak into that today. And then next week we got a visiting speaker, Hannah Bettany, who is Emma's sister. She is amazing, so make sure you are here next week. She will be sharing. And then in a fortnight, we're going to look at the details of this. What do we do with the laws and the rules that we find in the Bible? What do we obey? What do we not obey? And how do we know? So firstly, the Bible is full of covenants. But a covenant isn't something we kind of talk a lot about today. I've never had someone come to me and say, I want to make a covenant with you. It's a weird way of talking, except we do have covenants in our culture. The most common version of a covenant looks like this. That, if you believe it or not, that is me. I know. Emma forced me to shave on our wedding day. She was like, we've got to do this right. You've got to be clean shaven. And ever since. And then regretted it. She was like, I wanted to marry a man, not a child. And so it is what it is. But there was this day when I said to Emma, I want to make a covenant with you. I want to stand in front of a group of people and make a binding promise. And we said all of these words. I don't know what your wedding vows were. Ours went for something like for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. We made an agreement. We made a vow. We made a covenant. And that covenant wasn't that each of us was always going to be amazing. It was that we would be faithful to one another, that we would be present, that we would honor and respect each other, and that we would do our best to love each other in the way that they deserve to be loved. Or even more, we would love them in the way that God commands us to love one another, which often isn't the way that we deserve to be loved. And the truth is that even though I made this vow, even though I made this covenant, there are so many times when I've dropped the ball. There are so many times when I haven't loved as I should. There's so many times when she said something and my mind has just been somewhere else and I haven't even been listening, and I feel like I've not done as good as I can. But at the same time, my heart and my intention and Emma's heart and her intention has been ever since to honor this covenant that we made for one another. And it's binding. For us, it says that we would commit to this for the rest of our lives. And that's our intention. And what God does in the Bible is he makes covenants with people. And these covenants are vows. They're not just like, let's have a chat about something. They're solemn, they're serious, and there's consequences if you don't live up to your side of the covenant. And the first covenant that we find in the Bible, there's 5 that we see throughout Scripture. The first one we see is with Noah. It's called the Noahic covenant, which goes like this. This is in Genesis chapter 9, and this is what God says to Noah. He says, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you and with every living creature Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Whenever a rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. What I find most interesting about this covenant is that he says that the covenant is for his benefit. He says he will see the rainbows and it will remind him of his promise to us. So, 4 things interesting about this covenant. The first is that God makes a promise. He says that he will uphold the rhythms of the earth in order to sustain life. After he has just obliterated the world with this flood, you can imagine Noah and the family, every time it starts to rain, you can imagine they'd be like, oh my goodness, it's going to happen again. I knew I shouldn't have drunk so much in the vineyard. I'm in trouble now. And God will say, no, you don't need to be afraid. I promise, I swear to you that I will look after this planet. I will maintain it. There is nothing that you need to fear that I'm going to do to you on this earth. And what are the obligations of creation in this covenant? Nothing. God, it's not about us. We don't have to do anything right or wrong. It doesn't matter what we do. God says, this is all on me. And he creates a symbol of a rainbow. And what lots of people say is the rainbow is literally like a bow and arrow pointed away from us. He's like, the danger isn't on you. The danger is pointed in a different direction. The earth is safe for humans to flourish. The Noahic covenant. Then we fast forward a few chapters in the Bible and we meet another guy called Abraham. And God comes to Abraham, finds him with his family in the middle of nowhere. We don't know what they were doing. We don't know what was happening. We just know that they were all right and they've got a little bit of money. He's a wealthy guy. And God says this to him: I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And this is a covenant that God makes with Abraham. It's a formal agreement. He's like, this isn't just whimsical. I swear this. This is what will happen. So God's agreement, he's going to bless all of Abraham's descendants. Abraham has to leave his home and follow God. He doesn't get told where it's going to be. He doesn't get told how he's going to achieve this. God just says, are you willing to trust me? Are you willing to come? Are you willing to follow me? And Abraham says yes. And he steps out and he starts following God. There's a symbol to remind Abraham of this blessing that he has to have, and that all of his children, or at least all of his male children, have to have as well. And that symbol is circumcision, and it marks him and it marks his family as being different. They're children of the promise, children of the covenant. And the purpose of this covenant is that there will be blessings to the whole world through one single family. Fast forward again. His family have many, many children, and they have good times, they have hard times, they get in a lot of trouble at points. They end up as slaves, they get rescued from slavery. God pulls them out of Egypt in this miraculous, amazing picture, and then he brings another covenant. This is called the Mosaic covenant. And this is what God says to Moses: you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. And so this covenant, God comes to Moses and he says, I'm going to make you my people. You are going to be a holy nation. Holy literally means set apart. You're going to be set apart from all the nations of the world. You're going to be my people. I'm going to live with you. I'm going to be close with you. We're going to be one. This is how it should be. One kingdom, one God. And Israel, you have responsibility in terms of this covenant. Just like me and Emma standing up and I made a covenant to her and she made a covenant to me. God says, I commit that I will be your God and I'll make you my holy people. But you have to commit to following my will. You have to commit to following my way. You have to follow the law. And Moses gave them the 10 Commandments. And what's interesting, in the 10 Commandments, it says that there is a symbol to remind them of the covenant. And that symbol is the Sabbath. The Sabbath. One day a week when they would stop working and spend a whole day in worship of God. And this was supposed to disrupt their rhythms, to upset their plans so that they would constantly come back to God. And they would be reminded, we're not meant to be like everyone else. Our purpose here isn't to go after ambition. Our purpose here isn't to go after what all the other nations are going after. Our purpose here is to be a holy people. And so we stop, we lay aside a whole day, and we worship God. That's what the Sabbath was. And the purpose of this covenant was to restore a broken nation into a people who lived in harmony with God. And so we get 3 covenants. Years go past. This nation has times when they smash it and they're close to God. They have other times when they mess up and then they find themselves in trouble. And every time they mess up, there's now consequences because they've broken a covenant with God. They find themselves riding high. They find themselves falling low. And then we get to the Davidic covenant. And this is a covenant that God makes with King David. And he says this, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." So God, speaking to King David at a time of incredible stress and pressure in his life, says that he swears to David that he will establish David's ancestor as an eternal king. What a promise. What must David have been thinking in that moment? How could he have understood what this meant? But God says to David that your descendants, in order to remain as kings forever and ever, they need to remain faithful and they need to obey God's will. What was the symbol of this covenant? Well, it's hard to say. It's not obvious. Maybe there was no symbol. I think that maybe the actual king themselves was a reminder year after year of this promise to Israel that they were going to have an eternal king. And the purpose of this covenant was an eternal king who will extend God's kingship over the nations. And we see this all the way through the Old Testament. Covenant, 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 covenant. This was what God was telling them. If you were to speak to Israelis or the Israelites or the people, the Jewish people, this was their story. This is what they were believing and this is what they were longing for. But the trouble was that they kept messing up and they found that foreign invaders came and they took control. They found that they were supposed to be thriving and famine came and they struggled. And it looked like these covenants weren't working. It looks like these covenants were falling apart. It was shaky. And into the midst of some of the most stressful and difficult moments in the history of Israel, the prophets came and they promised a new covenant. And this is what Jeremiah says. He says, "The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me. From the least to the greatest, I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more." God says that there's going to come a day. There's going to come a day when there'll be a new covenant, when I will heal your hearts, when I will be close to you, when I will forgive everything that you have done wrong. He's saying at the moment, you've got all of these things that are your obligations to remain faithful to me. And he says, and to be honest, it's like a marriage, and the problem is you're not a faithful spouse. You're going off and you're having affairs, and you're messing around with other beliefs and other gods and other lifestyles, and I'm a husband who's remaining faithful to you, but your heart isn't for me. He says, so I promise that there will come a day when I make a new covenant. This one won't be about you keeping the right behavior. This will be flowing deeper. I'm going to change your hearts. I'm going to be close to you. And there's no obligation that he says on this. This isn't going to happen because we do something. And what's interesting is that there is a symbol. And we see this symbol through Jesus. Jesus, in Luke chapter 22, he says this. He says, he took a cup of wine. Let me just find this verse. Here we go, verse 20. After the supper, he took a cup of wine and he said, "This cup is my new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." And so Jesus is looking back at all of these old covenants. And he looks back at this covenant that God makes through the prophets and through Jeremiah. And he says, I'm going to fulfill them. I'm going to fulfill that covenant. And what's really, really interesting, if I could show you this on the next slide, we've got these four pictures. A covenant God makes with humans, a covenant God makes with the family of Abraham, a covenant that God makes with the tribe of Israel, a covenant that God makes with the line of King David. Only Jesus can fulfill all of those things. Jesus is fully human. Jesus is a child of Abraham. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus came from the line of David. He fulfilled all of those sides. And the purpose was that God wanted to create creation with harmony, creation in harmony. He wanted us to be blessed and to be a blessing. He wanted to establish a holy kingdom and an everlasting kingship. And so, when Jesus comes and he starts this sermon, the first thing that he starts talking about after the Beatitudes is the law and the Old Testament. And he says, the old covenants, all of these promises that God has made, they are now fulfilled in me. I am fulfilling all of them. I am performing everything that needed to be done so that then God was able to do what he wanted to be able to do through them. Their purpose can now be fulfilled through me. And then he says, I want to start a new covenant. A new covenant which is going to be sealed with my blood. A new covenant which is going to be paid for by me. And I find this really interesting because it's not how I often think about Christianity. I often think that Christians are the people who believe in God. Jesus doesn't say that. I often think that Christians are the people who go to church, but Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says Christians are the ones who have made a covenant with God. They've stepped into a covenantal relationship. And this covenantal relationship brings blessings. It brings protection. It brings purpose. It leads to us living a holy life. It leads to us becoming children in a family of God. It's people who say that God is my king and I'm going to be one of his people. There is a covenantal relationship. And he says, I've paid all the price and it's entirely free. In the same way that when I got married to Emma, I didn't pay anything. I didn't have to say, will you marry me? Here's $1,000. I didn't buy Emma. She's cost me a world ever since. But the relationship was free. And in exactly the same way, Jesus says the covenant is free. You can step in and have this free gift, but it will cost you everything. It will cost you everything ever since. Because now that I'm married to Emma, I look at the world differently. There are things that I don't do that I used to do because I'm married. There are relationships that I don't have, which I used to have because I'm married. There are things that I would love to do, but I don't get to do because I'm married. Because your priorities have shifted. Why? Because I made a covenant. Because I made a promise. I said, I will put you first. Before anybody else on this planet, you are my number one. I will honor you. I will follow you. I will be with you. That's a covenant. And Jesus says, we have a covenant together. We're children of a covenant. It changes the way that we see everything. And what I find interesting is this covenant is a covenant that Jesus says will transform us from the inside out. It's not a covenant that's all about behaving the right way. It's not a covenant that's like, if you do this, then you're all right, and if you don't do this, you're out, I don't want to know you anymore. Jesus is not like that. He says, yes, it's got rhythms. We have to breathe in grace, and we have to breathe out grace. We have to breathe in love, and we have to breathe out love. We have to breathe in transformation and then speak out transformation. We need to know the peace of God inside here so that we can build a kingdom of peace out here. Just like there's rhythms to it. You're not just going to you're not just going to wake up and go, oh wow, my life is suddenly amazing. It's like, no. You have to lean in. You have to know the way that I'm teaching you. But it's pure grace. It's a pure gift. And he says, if you will follow me, you follow me into a covenant. And so what I've been trying to do through this series, last week, this week, and moving forward, is I've been trying to not tell you what to do off the back of this. It's quite hard. I find it easy to do that. I've been trying not to. And I want you to reflect. And this is the question, I'll put it up here. This is the question that I want you to think about. If we've got time, I want you to maybe chat to somebody next to you. If you're an extrovert, speak, articulate. If you're an introvert, get out your phone or get out one of those journals and spend a moment writing. But this is what it makes me wonder. How does being in a covenantal relationship with Jesus change the way that you see your faith, the approach to the Bible, and the way that you live in community? What, through this passage, is God saying to you today? Where does the rubber hit the road for you in your life? And what we're going to do, we're going to take 5 minutes to just chew on this, to think about this, to pray on this. If you want to get some space and just say, Lord, what do you want to say to me today? What is it that you need to awaken in me? If you want to chat, find some people to chat. And then after 5 minutes or so, I'm going to bring everybody back together and we're going to spend some time sharing communion and remembering what it is that Jesus did for us.